Today on Locked On Canadiens, it's 2010 all over again. We're talking about trading Carey Price and the legacy Jaroslav Halak leaves in Montreal.
You are Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into episode 1354 of Locked On Canadiens. Thank you for making us your first listen of the day, for subscribing wherever you get your podcast. Doing that supports us here at the show and ensures you do not miss an episode. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. My name is Ian Boisvert, also known as That Maybe It's Ian. I'm not joined, as I usually am, by the wonderful Laura Saba, also known as the Active Stick. She's taken the week off to do some traveling, see some people, so you're hanging with me this week. We have some fun stuff to talk about. We've got two goalies who have dominated the conversation in Montreal over the last, what's that now, 15 years. In Jaroslav Halak retiring, we'll talk about his legacy in Montreal and really just the tremendous career he had in the National Hockey League. We'll talk about Carey Price, as now it sort of might make a little bit more sense for the Canadiens to move his contract as it enters the final year. And we'll take a look at next summer. The 2026 free agency class should be one that the Canadiens are very excited to jump into, with a lot of cap space and ready to go. So we'll take a look at what might be available, what's realistic, what we can dream about, and potentially, how that summer could be the one that shapes the Canadiens for years to come. But let's start with the news. Jaroslav Halak announced his retirement. 17 years in the National Hockey League, played for a bunch of teams. He was obviously drafted in Montreal. Played in St. Louis, obviously traded there afterwards. The Islanders, the Bruins, the Rangers, the Canucks, and the Washington Capitals. It's funny how he ended up in Washington for a year after, of course, that being the Washington Capitals series being everyone's in the mainstream hockey world, their introduction to this goaltender. I find that, when he left Montreal, I should say, when Halak was traded out of Montreal, there was a lot of hand wringing over whether or not it was the right choice in the moment, right? I mean, now we kind of know that Carey Price was the more premium elite goaltender, but to say that that Halak couldn't have been an elite starting goalie in Montreal, I don't know that that's necessarily the case. He ends his career 581 games played, a .915 save percentage, sub 2 goals against average. Halak had a very nice career for himself. He's one of those goalies who played on a bunch of teams because I think a bunch of teams wanted him. He's not a journeyman for the sake of just moving around. He was sort of the perfect stopgap goalie if you were waiting on another one to show up, or you wanted a premium backup behind a younger netminder, or maybe a netminder who, dealt with a little bit of injury problems. You wanted that guy behind your starter. Obviously, the legacy that he leaves in Montreal, Jaroslav Halak, is Halak Spring, right? The 2010 run. That it was obviously not something anyone expected the Canadiens to be able to do. That first round series, they're coming in as the 8th seed. They got in on the last day of the season with a loser point against the Toronto Maple Leafs, and they go into the first round against the President's Trophy winning Washington Capitals, who had effectively not played meaningful hockey in a month and a half because they had clinched the playoffs so early into their, with so much time left in their season that, they definitely took their foot off the gas. They didn't really need to push all that hard. That first game, Halak was dominant in that one. The Capitals fired 47 shots. He made 45 saves, 2 goals against. Montreal wins that one in overtime on Plakanitz's goal that beat Jose Theodore on the other end. And then it got a little rocky. He lost a game 6-5 in overtime in Washington, a game that the Canadiens were ahead. They had multiple multi-goal leads throughout that game. Then a 5-1 loss. He doesn't survive that game. He ends up getting yanked in that one in favor of Carey Price. Carey Price loses the next one. And then the final 3 games of this series, I think, is the high water mark for this goalie in Montreal. Like, this is where he made it all. He made a name for himself. Game 5, 38 shots against, 37 saves, only one goal, 974. They win 2-1. They needed every save from him in that one. The next game, game 6, 54 shots against, 53 saves, one goal against. They win 4-1. And finally, game 7, 42 shots against, 41 saves. They win 2-1. They needed every save from him in that game. And I know that in that one, Montreal took a very late 2-0 lead on Dominic Moore's goal, where he just kind of went to the net, had a pretty, it seemed pretty harmless at first until he was immediately right in the slot and was able to get a great shot. Washington then, got one late. It was very reminiscent of the game 7 against the Toronto Maple Leafs in the bubble season, where, Toronto didn't have anything the entire game. Montreal went up 2 really late. I think Nylander scored for Toronto that gave them, that made it feel like they were coming back, and then that was really it. It didn't go anywhere from that. So, like, that series to me, like, growing up, that was my first real taste of true playoff hockey in Montreal. I had seen, they had won a playoff round a few times in my life. They had beaten Boston in the first round. They got to Philadelphia in that second round in one of those series. I think in the previous series, or 2 seasons before, the last time they made the playoffs before Halak Spring, they had won a round and then gotten beaten by the Philadelphia Flyers, which ultimately is what also did in this Halak team, the Flyers in the conference final. But that was the first time, playoffs in Montreal really meant something to me. And I think I can say that for, my entire generation of fans, right? It was the first time that you could start to see players that just took over series, because it was Halak, no question. He was the reasons 1, 2, 3, and 4 that the Canadiens won any of their games in that playoff series. But also Mike Camilleri was unbelievable in both that series and the Pittsburgh series. I remember one goal he scored against Pittsburgh. It was a rebound that bounced to him. He kicked it out of midair and then whacked it into the net out of midair. One of the most incredible goals that nobody talks about. So you had those two. We had, you had PK Subban making his announcement to the league that he had arrived. There's a lot of fun parts of that team. That was sort of the Gomez era before it really soured for all of us. Gomez and Gianta were really fun in that playoff run, especially. But, then that eventually didn't last very long. The following season was that 2011 season where Carey Price obviously takes the net over, and, they push the Bruins to 7 games. He was incredible in that series. He was incredible that season. So we kind of immediately flipped the script on, did the Canadiens make the right choice, keeping Price instead of Halak? But I often wonder what would have happened if they made a different decision. I think Halak was a very good goalie, but I don't think he could have been the goalie for those Canadiens teams under Michel Therrien that were scoring 1 or 2 goals a game, right? Like, they needed every ounce out of Carey Price to get anything out of that era of the Montreal Canadiens. I often wonder, if Halak was able to bring in, I believe it was Ian Schultz, who never played for the Canadiens any meaningful amount, and Lars Eller. I wonder, if they decide to trade Carey Price, is that return better? Are we getting something back that is a little bit more substantial? And don't get me wrong, Lars Eller was fantastic for the Canadiens, big fan of that player. But wondering, what it's one of those forks in history where we wonder what could have happened. The Subban for Weber trade is another fork in history for the Canadiens. I often think about, like, how this could have been different. We probably don't get that 2014 run. We probably don't get the run to the Cup final if Carey Price isn't around. Maybe there's another goalie that takes over. Maybe it's still Halak. But those were high water moments for that goalie in Carey Price, who I just don't think any goalie could have filled that spot, who could have been, sort of like I said about Halak in the 2010 series, who couldn't have been reasons 1, 2, 3, and 4 that his team won any games in the playoffs. So it's an interesting retrospective. I'll always remember, I think it was the game that Carey Price got hurt against the New York Rangers, not in the playoffs. It was a few seasons later, in the regular season, where we knew the knee issue was chronic, where I remember he got hurt and pulled, And I remember there was a caller who called in to TSN 690 and said, "Is there any way we could get Halak back?" And I think that is indicative of just how electric that run was for Halak in Montreal, that 2010 season, where he put this team on his back and took them very close to getting to a Stanley Cup final, honestly. Um, but I think it's also indicative of how this fan base and market at times treated Carey Price, because there was always that, well, we had a goalie who took us on this incredible run. If Price hadn't delivered to the extent that he did, there would have been a lot more conversations about whether or not they made the right choice in trading Halak and keeping Carey Price. So congrats to Jaroslav Halak, a fantastic NHL career, just a truly great goalie. Montreal, he was in Montreal at a time where the only good players they drafted were goalies with him and Carey Price. So congrats to him on retirement. It was a really, really fun to watch him play in the National Hockey League. And, I'm hoping all the best for him in retirement. All right, we'll leave that there. When we come back, we'll talk about trading Carey Price, sort of as we just did. Things might have changed for the Canadiens in determining whether or not they need to move Carey Price's contract. And we'll get into all of that in just a minute here on Locked On Canadiens. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburnt at the beach. I've been using FanDuel to track my favorite matchups, and the app keeps it fresh with new daily promotions and fun ways to bet. I love the anytime home run category. Just picking a guy to hit a dinger on any given day is really fun. New to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. That's a $5 bet for new customers and can get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right, we are back. And we're going to talk about a report of sorts. I'm not going to put the hat on. It's not a rumor roundup. I don't think that there's any reason to be doing that. But it's regarding Carey Price's contract. He's entering the last year of that deal. We talked about moving it earlier on this off season, or maybe it was right towards the end of the season. But things have changed, I believe. So Chris Johnston of SDPN, he noted that the Canadiens are probably going to be interested in moving that deal in September. Well, why September, you ask? He has a bonus to be paid out. Reportedly, it's September 1st. Can't really truly clarify that, but let's for all intents and purposes believe it's September 1st. It is a $5.5 million bonus. He has a $7.5 million salary for next year, which means there's only $2 million left in salary for his contract next year. So why? Let's talk about this from the Canadiens' perspective first. Why would they want to trade Carey Price's contract? Well, the fact of this is that they hate being in LTIR when they don't have to be. Why do they hate being in long-term injured reserve? Well, you don't accrue cap space throughout the year. When you're on Puckpedia towards the trade deadline, and there's two numbers. It's total cap space and estimated daily cap space, or cap space on this day. It's because as the season goes on, cap hits get prorated to what is left on the contract, what is left on that year. So by the time you get to the trade deadline, those cap hits are far smaller, meaning you have more cap space to acquire things like that. When you are on LTIR, you are not accruing that cap space because technically you don't have any cap space. LTIR is not cap space. I think that's a common misconception about the LTIR and the way that the cap works. When you are in LTIR, you are allowed to exceed the salary cap by the amount that is on long-term injured reserve. It does not mean that you have salary cap space. It does not mean that you have any space left. So that's important because you're not accruing anything. And it means that your team essentially at the trade deadline will only have what is available in your LTIR window. So you're at a disadvantage to other teams. LTIR, again, allows you to exceed the cap hit by the cap hits that you have placed on long-term injured reserve. There's also one of the things the Canadiens are dealing with this season is performance bonus overages. They were over on their performance bonuses by 1.7 million, I think, last year because they were on long-term injured reserve, and they exceeded the cap by that amount, and they needed to they need to get below that in order for that to not happen next year. And it might happen again next year with Ivan Demidov being, he might win the Calder. Lane Hudson is still eligible for his bonus, his entry level bonuses as well. So they have to be very careful with how they manage that next year. The reason I think the Canadiens might be interested now, as opposed to when we had this conversation before, is that the Canadiens acquired Noah Dobson and signed him to a massive contract that they need to now figure out what to do with. When we made this call earlier, that it didn't really matter if the Canadiens moved it or not, because they probably could have fit Carey Price's contract into the cap without putting it on LTIR. They hadn't acquired Noah Dobson and his $9.5 million contract. Now they have him. They currently sit $4.5 million above the cap, so they can put Carey Price on the salary cap, and have, essentially $6 million of that would be what you could exceed the cap by moving forward. That the Canadiens don't want to be in that space. I think it's very clear. Like last year, they wanted to get under that so that they didn't start the season with Carey Price on LTIR. So they're going to try not to. The next question for me is, who's interested? I think the easiest answer here is non-competitive teams. And with non-competitive teams being used as the barometer here, the quote that keeps coming to my mind, I think it's Pierre LeBrun: everyone is trying to get better except Pittsburgh. And it's kind of true. Like, there's only one team truly trying to sell off everything right now, and it's the Pittsburgh Penguins. Pittsburgh could, in their current situation, take on all of Carey Price's contract and still be about $2.5 million under the cap. So they could conceivably take that cap hit, not put him on LTIR, just keep him under their salary cap. They can be accruing cap space throughout the year, and they can add some kind of sweetener from the Canadiens at that point. That's probably going to cost the Canadiens a lot to offload the entirety of that contract. It's not like there's a team out there who's under the floor. I think everybody is technically above the floor now. There's nobody out there who desperately needs that kind of contract in order to get above the floor. Like the Blackhawks, I believe, have like the lowest. They have the most cap space. The floor is at $70 million. Nobody is below, I think, 71 million. Not 74 million is the lowest, and it's the Blackhawks. So nobody needs to get to the floor. So if you're hearing, well, just trade him to a team that needs to get to the floor, that team doesn't exist. That's not something that's happening. With that said, like, I think back to how the Canadiens took on a first-round pick to take the last year of Sean Monahan's deal, because Calgary put themselves in a poor position by saying, we want to sign Nazem Kadri. We've already signed him. Oops, now we have to offload a contract in order to make this work. I don't know that it's going to cost a first. It wouldn't surprise me if it does. If that's the price, though, I don't know if the Canadiens would do that. I think they'd rather keep the first-round pick as ammunition later on, as opposed to, trying to just push this out of the way so they don't have to be on LTIR next year. I think they want to be off of LTIR, but not to the point where it's going to be, prohibitive for them to move that deal. I think a first round pick would be kind of silly. I wouldn't mind maybe the second that Columbus had sent over in the Patrick Laine deal, right? If you took on that as sort of a sweetener for taking on a $9.5 million contract, and oh yeah, you got a guy who can hammer the puck like nobody else in the league, sending that out the door to now get rid of Carey Price's contract, I don't necessarily have any issues with that. Maybe value-wise, it's not great, but at least from a, asset in, asset out standpoint, it's, you literally use that pick to eat a contract, and now you're using it to yeet a contract, so to speak. So the Canadiens, that would make sense to me. I also wonder, like, could the Canadiens retain half and still be under the salary cap? I think they could. Looking at their Puckpedia page right now, they have, like I said, $4.5 million in current cap space, or over the cap. So if they were to trade $5.25 of Carey Price's contract, that would put them under the cap by about $1 million, give or take a couple dollars, but that would get it done. I wonder if a team like Pittsburgh would rather do that. or a team like an Anaheim or San Jose, like these teams who aren't going to be competitive this year and may want to weaponize the cap space that they have left. So I'm wondering if there's any kind of retention involved here should the Canadiens decide to go this route. We'll see how it ends up playing out. We won't know until September. Maybe there will be some rumblings as we get closer to, hey, this team is going to make the move to take on Price's contract. But I would be surprised if we knew fully before September 1st. So we have about a month and a half before we'll learn the fate of this player. I do want to say, I think, a lot of people are very emotional about the concept of trading Carey Price's contract, and I get it. I do. Because it's closure of sorts. It's the end, right? The end of that story in Montreal would be this all-time great being sent out as a salary cap transaction, and it would be weird to see him associated with any other team. He's never going to play a game, so I don't think that that's part of the calculus in fans' minds, but I get it. I will say, though, that it's business. This is going to have to happen, I would imagine. I mean, the Canadiens, if they can figure out a way to get it done, they will. I think this is just a cap hit at this point. It's unfortunate the way that it ended for Carey Price in Montreal. Carey Price is not just a cap hit, but the contract is. And if the Canadiens have an opportunity to make it so that next year is easier for them and the season after, thinking about potential performance bonuses overage, they need to act on that. I when Carey Price didn't make the Hall of Fame this year, I sort of said that, well, you know what? That means next year his contract ends, he can officially retire, and he gets put in the Hall of Fame. And that sort of closure, I think, is what's going to matter more than any sort of trade that happens. So I hope you all handle that okay. It's going to happen. I hope that we are not so emotional that we're cursing the name of the general manager because he moved a cap hit out the door. So we'll leave that there. I'm sure we'll be able to talk more about this once we actually learn what's happening in September. But before we get there, there's not really much we can do. But we're going to continue to look even further forward. We're going to move to the 2026 UFA period and talk about how much money the Canadiens might have, what players might be available. Should we dream about some of these big names, and should we just sort of understand that maybe they'll do something safe instead? And we'll get into all that on Locked On Canadiens. All right, welcome back. We're taking a look at free agency 2026. Puckpedia says that the Canadiens will have about $39 million in cap space next summer, which is a lot. That's a lot of money for them to be able to throw around. Notably, let's go through the unrestricted free agents. Very notably so, Mike Matheson and Patrick Laine, as well as Carey Price, but he might be off the books before that. And Sammy Blais. That's it for UFAs. There's only 4 UFAs next year, and only 2 of them are key mainstays on the roster. Restricted free agents: Kirby Dach, Joe Veleno, Zach Bolduc, Arber Xhekaj, Lane Hutson being the big RFA. So we have some significant subtractions in Mike Matheson, maybe Dach, and Laine. And we have significant raises in Hutson, maybe Xhekaj, and honestly, maybe Dach. We'll see how this season goes, but I wouldn't put it past the Canadiens to continue to want him around should this season go well. It should, while there are still significant pieces to consider next year of the guys who are already on this team, it should be plenty to keep the group together. That $39 million they have should be plenty to keep this group together and also improve. So who should the Canadiens be interested in? I want to start with a safe-ish pick first, a safe sort of member of that UFA pool who I think could reasonably find himself in Montreal, especially should the 2C hole not be dealt with in any meaningful way. And that's Nick Schmaltz. He's out in, I almost said Arizona. He's out in Utah, 6 foot center, 184 pounds. He's a righty, so it would add to that right shot center mix that they already have. Last season, 20 goals, 43 assists for 63 points. That's for like a second line center. I think that's perfect. That's exactly what you would want a second line center to be able to chip in on any team, especially if he's going to be playing with a guy like Ivan Demidov and maybe one day down the line like Zachary Bolduc or somebody like that. The cap wages projects, they have a salary or a contract projection for each player who's about to hit UFA. They project 6 years, about $6.8 million. What I like about Schmaltz's game so far is just looking at the numbers. It's a very steady progression. And there's not one season that, he sort of spikes and then returns to normal. It's been very steady, couple points picked up over each year. It makes me think that this player is on a development path that makes sense. And he's sort of become the player that we, will understand him to be. He's in his mid to late 20s. So this is sort of going to be his first big chance to cash in on the free agent market. If the 2C hole is not solved by next summer, I think he could be a legitimate option. I think that makes a lot of sense for Montreal if they can somehow convince him to come and play in Montreal. Again, they haven't, other than, luring Noah Dobson, we still haven't seen them woo a free agent. I guess Dobson does really, it does move the needle for me in that conversation, but we haven't seen them do it where they're competing, quite honestly, with 31 other teams. We know that with Dobson, they were competing with the Blues and the Blue Jackets. Montreal was able to win that race, but we haven't seen them have to do that with the rest of the league. And that's where I think this next conversation comes in. There is a big four available as free agents next summer in Connor McDavid, Kirill Kaprizov, Jack Eichel, and Kyle Connor out of Winnipeg. Odds are none of these guys get to UFA. So I want to point that out to say that I am very doubtful that honestly any of these players get to that point. I think the teams that they're on will make those things happen. McDavid's making it dramatic though, isn't he? Like I find that funny that he's earned the right to not talk about this, to not negotiate at this point. But if I was an Oilers fan or part of Oilers management, I'd be starting to get a little bit nervous about this. But I still, like, looking in from the outside, I think that you find a way to get this done. And if you don't, like with maybe not McDavid, but with any of the others that I named, Kaprizov, Eichel, or Connor, you're probably trying to trade them to a team that they will re-sign with so that you can recoup something. Those are three teams who are trying to win, relatively soon. In Minnesota, Vegas is always trying to win, and Winnipeg's taken some big strides over the last few years. If these guys do get to UFA, though, these are the guys that you have positioned yourself to take a run at, right? $39 million in cap space is nothing to sniff at. These are the guys that you when the Canadiens were talking about how they would take their swing when, they keep saying this summer is not as important as the next one. That's the summer they're looking at. I'm wondering if they're thinking about players like this and hoping that maybe they hang on to their free agency and make it to that market, and the Canadiens can try to convince them, hey, this would be a really great place for you to play. I think really the names there that would help the Canadiens the most are obviously, to me, McDavid and Eichel. They play center. They're absolute stars in their primes. Like, these are guys that you should be falling over yourself to throw money at. I doubt that, again, I not so much doubt that the Canadiens could woo them should they get to free agency, because I think the way that they've transformed their image throughout the league is really impressive. But again, I don't see a world where those guys make it. That's what makes those sorts of free agents special, right? Like, think of John Tavares in Toronto. Well, he was with the Islanders, and then, right up until July 1st, it seemed like he was going to go back to the Islanders, and then he hit midnight on July 1st without a contract, and it was over. That's sort of like, they would be that vibe for these players, but amplified to the nth degree. So again, these are the guys that you save up all that cap space for. These are the guys that you're able to take a swing on, because guys like Slavkovsky are coming in under 8. Caulfield's coming in under 8. Goalies coming in under 8. Suzuki's coming in under 8. Like, you've built a core that is not being paid all that much. And the fact that Dobson at 9.5 is your highest paid defenseman, at least for now, I feel pretty confident that, Lane Hudson becomes that guy sooner rather than later. But the fact that you have positioned yourself to be in this spot, it means to me that the Canadiens have at least thought that maybe we could get a conversation going with some of these players, and they could be Montreal Canadiens who could help us win a Stanley Cup. This season coming up is going to be incredibly important for that, because if the Canadiens take a significant step back, we're not talking about them being in the race for these players. We're talking about, they moved up too quickly. They moved too fast. They haven't actually rebuilt yet. But if they're around the same thing that they were this year, give or take a couple points, I think that we're still talking about them being in the chase for these players. And again, it's really tough to see these guys hit free agency, but man, it would be really cool. It would be really cool if Montreal could get their hands on one of these guys. All right, we'll leave that there. I'm sure we'll be talking about next year's free agent market until it hits. So hopefully some of those guys make it and we have some interesting conversations to be had. But let's hit our trivia and then head out of here for the day. Last question from last week. In Joe Veleno's final season in junior, he played in Drummondville with this Habs 6th-round pick. I don't believe anybody online had the answer, but as soon as we hung up, Laura, without hesitation, had the answer, and it was Xavier Simoneau. So congrats to Laura on getting that question right. All right, today's question is related to Jaroslav Halak and Carey Price. Jaroslav Halak recorded his first NHL win on February 18th, 2007 in Columbus. He did, however, give up a goal to the 6th overall pick in the 2005 NHL draft, immediately following Carey Price's selection. Before Columbus picked this player, general manager Doug MacLean excitedly said they're taking the goalie as he and his scouting staff high-fived at the excitement of being able to draft this player who scored on Jaroslav Halak in his first NHL win. If you know the answer of this player, put it in the comments down below. We'll shout you out on the next episode and let everybody know how smart you are. And that is going to do it for us today on this episode of wherever you get your podcast doing that supports us here on the show and ensures you do not miss an episode. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NHL podcast. There's no off-season, bringing you the daily league-wide stories that matter most with local coverage you love from Locked On. Find Locked On NHL on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We are Locked On Canadiens everywhere we are posting things, Blue Sky, Instagram, and TikTok primarily. So follow us on those places. You'll get clips from the show and some other things that we float around. Like eventually we're going to have our full Martyism draft rosters posted with a nice graphic for all of you guys so we can all follow along throughout the season. So you won't want to miss that. You can follow me at Maybe It's Ian. You can follow my co-host Laura at The Active Stick. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys on Wednesday.